I don't shake hands with people like you." The words sliced through the marble lobby of Seattle's most prestigious hotel like a blade through silk. CEO Richard Blackstone had just publicly humiliated a receptionist in front of dozens of watching executives, his voice dripping with disdain. Margaret Chen, 58, slowly lowered her outstretched hand. Her worn blue uniform stood in stark contrast to his $3,000 Italian suit, her plastic watch versus his gleaming Rolex, her quiet dignity versus his thunderous arrogance. The bustling lobby fell silent, whispers died. Even the elevator music seemed to pause. What Richard Blackstone didn't know was that this simple woman in a faded uniform held a secret that would cost him exactly $1.5 million within the next 72 hours. And it all started with one refused handshake that would change everything. The most expensive mistake of his life had just begun. Margaret had worked at the Grand Pacific Hotel for 15 years. Every morning at 7 a.m. sharp, she greeted guests with the same warm smile that had welcomed thousands of visitors to Seattle. Today should have been no different. Richard Blackstone swept through the revolving doors like he owned the building, which, in many ways, he did. His company controlled half the commercial real estate in downtown Seattle. The Grand Pacific was just another property in his vast empire. "Good morning, Mr. Blackstone," Margaret had said, extending her hand in professional courtesy. She knew his name from the reservation system: presidential suite, 3-night stay, VIP treatment. His cold stare traveled from her face to her outstretched hand, then back up with visible disgust. The rejection wasn't just personal. It was a public declaration of superiority, witnessed by his entire entourage of lawyers, assistants, and business partners. Margaret's colleagues behind the marble counter shifted uncomfortably. The concierge pretended to study his computer screen. Even the bellhops found sudden interest in the Persian rugs beneath their feet. But something flickered in Margaret's dark eyes. Not hurt, not anger, something else entirely. She reached into her uniform pocket and discreetly photographed his business card lying on the counter. Her fingers moved with surprising speed and precision across her phone screen, typing a message in what appeared to be Mandarin. "Some people are born to serve," Richard muttered to his assistant, loud enough for Margaret to hear. "Others are born to lead." He had no idea that Margaret understood every word of the Mandarin conversation his Chinese business partners had been having in the elevator. He didn't know she'd already identified the nature of his visit, the $1.5 million merger with Chen Industries that would make him one of the wealthiest men on the West Coast. What was about to unfold would teach Richard Blackstone that assumptions about people can be the most expensive mistakes of all. The humiliation rippled through the hotel staff like wildfire in dry grass. By lunch break, every employee from housekeeping to management knew what had happened in the lobby. Margaret sat alone in the staff cafeteria, methodically eating her homemade sandwich. Around her, conversations stopped and started in uncomfortable spurts. Some colleagues offered sympathetic glances. Others avoided eye contact entirely, afraid that association with her might somehow taint their own job security. "Margaret, are you okay?" whispered Rosa, a housekeeper who'd worked alongside her for 8 years. That was completely out of line. Margaret nodded quietly, but her hands trembled slightly as she folded her napkin. 15 years of invisible service. 15 years of, "Good morning, sir, and have a pleasant stay, ma'am." 15 years of being part of the furniture. She thought about her late husband, James, who used to say that dignity wasn't something others could take away, only something you could give up. But some days, holding on to dignity felt like gripping sand. The hotel manager, Mr. Peterson, approached their table with obvious discomfort. "Margaret, I heard about the incident. I want you to know that we value your service here." The unspoken "but" hung in the air like smoke. Richard Blackstone represented millions in corporate bookings. Margaret represented nothing that showed up on quarterly reports. "I understand, Mr. Peterson," Margaret replied with the same professionalism she'd maintained for 15 years. But her mind was elsewhere, calculating time zones, remembering phone numbers she hadn't called in years. That evening, as she rode the bus home to her small apartment in the International District, Margaret made a decision. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through contacts she hadn't touched in 2 decades. Her finger hesitated over one name. David Chen, CEO, Chen Industries America. She pressed call. Richard Blackstone's corner office occupied the entire 42nd floor of the Blackstone Tower, offering a commanding view of Elliott Bay and the Seattle skyline he'd helped shape. Crystal awards lined mahogany shelves. Oil paintings of his father and grandfather watched from gilded frames. His assistant, Bradley, nervously reviewed the final merger documents. "Sir, the Chen Industries representatives confirmed their arrival tomorrow. The contracts are ready for signature." Richard leaned back in his leather chair, savoring the moment. Chen Industries was the missing piece in his Pacific Rim expansion. With their manufacturing capabilities and his real estate empire, they dominate the entire West Coast market. $1.5 million to start, he mused, swirling aged whiskey in a crystal tumbler. But this is just the beginning, Bradley. Within 5 years, we're looking at $100 million contracts. His phone buzzed with a text from the hotel concierge. "Your dinner reservation at Le Bernardin is confirmed for 8 p.m. The Chen Industries advance team will meet you there." Richard smiled. Everything was falling into place perfectly. The preliminary meetings had gone well. The Chinese executives seemed impressed by his portfolio. Tomorrow's signing would be a formality. He'd built his empire on reading people, understanding leverage, knowing exactly where everyone stood in the hierarchy of power. CEOs dealt with CEOs, service staff served, the natural order of things. His father had taught him that respect was earned through success, not handed out to everyone like participation trophies. "You're either predator or prey in this business, son. Never forget which one you are." As evening shadows stretched across his office, Richard felt the familiar satisfaction of another conquest approaching. The Chen Industries deal would cement his legacy, proving once again that Richard Blackstone got what Richard Blackstone wanted. He had no idea that at that very moment, a nobody in a hotel uniform was having a conversation that would shatter his perfect world. The call lasted exactly 17 minutes. Margaret spoke in rapid Mandarin, her voice carrying an authority that would have shocked anyone who knew her only as the quiet hotel receptionist. She sat in her modest kitchen, surrounded by photos of a life most people never knew she'd lived. Graduation from Harvard Business School, corporate awards, newspaper clippings from Hong Kong's financial district. "David, it's been too long," she said, switching to English as her nephew's familiar voice came through the phone. "Aunt Margaret? I thought you were in Hong Kong. Mom said you'd disappeared after Uncle James died. I needed time away from that world. I've been in Seattle for 15 years, working quietly." She paused, studying the business card photo on her phone. "But something happened today that I can't ignore." As she recounted the lobby incident, David's silence grew heavy. Margaret could almost hear his thoughts racing across the connection to the Chen Industries headquarters. "You're telling me that Richard Blackstone, the man we're supposed to sign with tomorrow, publicly humiliated you because you're a hotel worker?" The handshake refusal was just the surface, David. "I watched him for 3 hours today. How he treats the bellhops, the cleaning staff, the security guards. This isn't about me, it's about character." Margaret walked to her window, looking out at the Seattle skyline dominated by the Blackstone Tower. "In our family, we were taught that how you treat those who can do nothing for you reveals everything about who you are." David was quiet for a long moment. "Aunt Margaret, do you realize what you're asking? This is a $1.5 million deal. Our board has already approved it." "I'm not asking you to do anything, David. I'm simply sharing information. What you do with it is your choice." But they both knew that Margaret Chen had never made a casual business call in her life. After hanging up, Margaret made green tea and sat by her window, watching lights flicker on across the city. Tomorrow would bring consequences she couldn't predict. At 11 p.m. Seattle time, the emergency board meeting of Chen Industries America was still in session. David Chen stood before a wall of monitors, displaying financial projections, contract details, and background reports on Blackstone Enterprises. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a situation," David announced to the virtual participants joining from Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Vancouver. "I've just learned some disturbing information about our potential partner." Board member Elizabeth Wong leaned forward on screen. David, we've done extensive due diligence. Blackstone's financials are solid. Their reputation in real estate is excellent. What could possibly... It's not about finances. It's about character. David shared the details of Margaret's call, watching faces change around the virtual conference table. Your aunt has been working as a hotel receptionist? Asked Michael Liu from Hong Kong. Margaret Chen, who negotiated the Singapore expansion, who closed the Taiwan semiconductor deal. David nodded grimly. She left the corporate world after Uncle James died, wanted anonymity, a simple life. But she's still family, and she still has the best business instincts of anyone I know. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Margaret Chen wasn't just David's aunt, she was a legend in their industry. Her analysis of character had saved Chen Industries millions in failed partnerships over the years. If Margaret says there's a character problem, there's a character problem, stated Chairman Chen from Hong Kong. The question is, what do we do about it? David looked at the Blackstone contracts spread across his conference table. $1.5 million. Months of negotiations, market expansion plans. I want to meet Richard Blackstone personally, he decided. Tomorrow, before the signing, at his hotel. David, if we pull out now, we're not pulling out. We're conducting additional due diligence. David's voice carried the same quiet authority that his aunt had wielded for decades. And I want Aunt Margaret there as our cultural consultant. The irony was perfect. Richard Blackstone was about to discover that the woman he'd dismissed as worthless was actually worth more than he could imagine. Richard Blackstone woke up at 5:30 a.m., as he had every day for the past 20 years. His penthouse apartment overlooked the same Seattle skyline he'd conquered one building at a time. Today would be the crown jewel, the Chen Industries signing that would establish his Pacific empire. His morning routine was military precise. 45 minutes at his private gym, protein shake, review of overnight emails from his Hong Kong contacts. Everything pointed to success. The Chen Industries advance team had been impressed with his portfolio presentation. The contracts were flawless. His lawyers had triple-checked every clause. Bradley arrived at 7 a.m. with disturbing news. Sir, I just received a call from Chen Industries. They want to modify today's meeting. Richard paused mid-sip of his imported coffee. Modify how? They're requesting a preliminary meeting at the Grand Pacific Hotel at 2 p.m. before the formal signing. Something about wanting to better understand your corporate culture. The words hung in the air like a gathering storm. In 25 years of business, Richard had never had a partner request to assess his corporate culture hours before a major signing. Who's requesting this? David Chen himself, sir, the CEO. He's flying in from Vancouver specifically for this meeting. Richard's confidence wavered for the first time in months. CEOs didn't make last-minute flights for routine signings. Something had shifted in the carefully orchestrated dance of their negotiations. Did they give any indication what prompted this? Bradley shifted uncomfortably. They mentioned something about ensuring cultural compatibility between our organizations. Sir, should I be concerned? Richard stared out at the city he'd conquered, his mind racing through possibilities. Had a competitor interfered? Had someone leaked unfavorable information about his business practices? The Chen Industries deal was worth far more than $1.5 million. It was his gateway to Asian markets, worth hundreds of millions. Schedule the meeting, he commanded, but uncertainty gnawed at him like acid. And Bradley, I want a complete background check on everyone David Chen has spoken to in Seattle in the past week. Sir, that might be difficult to find a way. Richard's voice carried the edge that had intimidated countless opponents. But beneath the surface, fear was creeping in like floodwater through cracks in a foundation. As he rode the elevator down to his waiting limousine, Richard tried to shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial. In his world, knowledge was power, and suddenly he felt blind. The Grand Pacific Hotel loomed ahead through his tinted windows, its familiar facade now seeming somehow ominous. Richard had no idea that inside those walls, a simple receptionist was preparing to change his life forever. Margaret arrived at work 2 hours early, but not to begin her usual duties. She sat in the hotel's business center, wearing a charcoal suit she hadn't touched in 15 years. The fabric still fit perfectly, though it carried the weight of memories she'd tried to leave behind. Her laptop screen displayed Chen Industries' latest quarterly reports, market analysis data she could read like sheet music. For the first time in decades, Margaret Chen wasn't hiding behind a service counter. She was preparing for corporate battle. David had arrived from Vancouver on the red-eye flight, his own exhaustion evident in the precise way he organized his briefing materials. At 28, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that came from being groomed for leadership since childhood, but Margaret could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "Aunt Margaret, I have to ask, are you absolutely certain about this? Blackstone's reputation in Seattle is impeccable. His business practices have never been questioned." Margaret turned her laptop screen toward him, displaying a series of news articles she'd found through careful research. "Look deeper, David. Not at what he builds, but how he builds it. The construction workers who've filed complaints, the small businesses he's forced out through predatory leasing, the city council members who've questioned his methods." She pulled up employment records, public filings, testimonies from former employees. "He's never been caught doing anything illegal, but patterns tell stories. How he treats people when he thinks no one is watching reveals everything." David studied the information with growing concern. "This changes our risk assessment completely, if this is how he operates. It gets worse." Margaret opened another file. "I spent last night researching his planned expansion into Hong Kong. He's been telling your board that he understands Asian business culture, but look at this." The screen showed Richard's previous attempts to enter Asian markets, failed partnerships, cultural misunderstandings, deals that collapsed due to his inability to show proper respect to international partners. "He sees Asia as a market to exploit, not a culture to respect," Margaret continued. "The partnership you're considering wouldn't just fail. It would damage Chen Industries' reputation across the Pacific Rim." David leaned back in his chair, the magnitude of the revelation sinking in. "How did our due diligence miss all this?" "Because you were looking at financial statements and legal compliance. You weren't looking at character." Margaret closed the laptop with finality. "In 15 years of watching him from behind that counter, I've seen who Richard Blackstone really is when he thinks no one important is watching." The weight of family legacy, corporate responsibility, and personal integrity converged in that moment. David made his decision. "Let's go meet Mr. Blackstone." The Grand Pacific's boardroom had been transformed into a battlefield, though only one side knew war had been declared. Richard arrived precisely on time, flanked by his team of lawyers and advisors, his confidence restored by morning research that showed Chen Industries had no apparent reason to withdraw from their agreement. He entered expecting a routine cultural courtesy meeting, the kind of face-saving gesture that often preceded major international signings. Instead, he found David Chen seated at the head of the polished mahogany table, reviewing documents with laser focus. "Mr. Blackstone, thank you for accommodating this last-minute meeting," David said, rising to offer a handshake that Richard accepted without hesitation. "I hope you understand our desire to ensure complete alignment before we finalize our partnership." "Of course," Richard replied smoothly, settling into his chair with practiced ease. "Though I'm curious what prompted this additional evaluation." David gestured toward the door. "I'd like you to meet our cultural consultant, who will be advising Chen Industries on American business practices." The door opened, and Margaret entered. But this wasn't the invisible hotel worker in a faded uniform. This was Margaret Chen in an impeccably tailored business suit, carrying herself with the unmistakable authority of someone who had commanded boardrooms across 3 continents. Her silver hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon. Her jewelry was understated but expensive. Her presence filled the room like electricity. Richard's face drained of color as recognition dawned. The coffee cup in his hand began to shake almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Blackstone," David continued with perfect politeness, "I believe you've already met my aunt, Margaret Chen. She's been observing your business practices during your stay here, and frankly, Her report raises some concerning questions about cultural compatibility. The silence stretched like a taut wire. Richard's lawyers exchanged confused glances. His assistants looked between Margaret and their boss, trying to process what they were seeing. Margaret opened a leather portfolio and placed a photograph on the table, the image of Richard's business card she'd taken with her phone, time-stamped from yesterday's lobby incident. "Yesterday at 11:47 a.m., she said in perfect, unaccented English. "You refused to shake my hand because, in your words, you don't shake hands with people like me. Today, you're hoping to shake hands on a $1.5 million deal with people exactly like me." Richard stared at the photograph, then at Margaret, then at David, his mind struggling to process the impossible convergence of his two worlds. The most expensive handshake refusal in corporate history was about to be calculated. The revelation hit Richard like a physical blow. Every assumption he'd made, every calculation he'd performed, every strategy he'd employed had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who held the real power in this negotiation. "Margaret Chen," he whispered, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "Your family." "More than family," David interjected coldly. "Margaret is the architect of our North American expansion strategy. She negotiated our entry into the Toronto market, our Vancouver partnerships, our Seattle real estate acquisitions. For the past 5 years, she's been our primary advisor on American business culture." Richard's world tilted on its axis. The woman he'd dismissed as insignificant had been evaluating him as a potential partner for years. Every interaction, every casual encounter in the hotel lobby, every moment when he'd treated staff as invisible. She'd been watching, analyzing, taking notes. "But you work at the hotel," he stammered, grasping for something solid in his rapidly shifting reality. Margaret's smile held no warmth. "I work many places, Mr. Blackstone. The hotel position allows me to observe how potential partners behave when they think no one important is watching. It's remarkable how much you can learn about someone's character when they believe you're powerless." David spread additional documents across the table, detailed behavioral assessments, cultural compatibility reports, risk analysis matrices, all bearing Margaret's signature and Chen Industries' letterhead. "For 18 months, we've been conducting comprehensive due diligence on Blackstone Enterprises," David continued. "Financial performance, legal compliance, market position, everything checked out perfectly. Until yesterday." Richard's legal team sat in stunned silence. His assistant Bradley looked physically ill. The contracts they'd prepared so meticulously now seemed like elaborate pieces of worthless paper. "The handshake incident wasn't just personal rudeness," Margaret explained, with clinical precision. "It was a definitive demonstration of judgment failure. Someone who would publicly humiliate a service worker lacks the emotional intelligence required for successful international partnerships." She turned to a fresh page in her portfolio. "Our Hong Kong partners specifically requested assessment of your cultural sensitivity. In Asian business relationships, respect for all individuals, regardless of perceived status, is non-negotiable." Richard felt the weight of his empire pressing down on him. Decades of building, conquering, accumulating, all threatened by one moment of reflexive arrogance. "You've been testing me," he said, his voice barely audible. "We've been giving you every opportunity to demonstrate your true character," Margaret corrected. "You chose to fail that test spectacularly." The room fell silent, except for the distant sounds of Seattle traffic far below. Richard Blackstone, master of his universe, sat powerless as his biggest deal crumbled around him. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Richard stared at the scattered documents, the photographic evidence, the carefully compiled reports that painted him as exactly what he'd never believed himself to be. A man whose success was built on a foundation of contempt for others. His lawyers began whispering urgent conferences, calculating damage control, but Richard held up a hand to silence them. This wasn't a legal problem that could be fixed with contracts or negotiations. This was a mirror being held up to show him who he'd become. "How long?" he asked quietly. "How long have you been observing me?" Margaret consulted her notes with professional detachment. 15 years. Every time you've stayed at the Grand Pacific, Every interaction with staff, every casual comment you thought no one important heard. I documented patterns of behavior that revealed character flaws incompatible with international partnership. She turned the portfolio toward him, showing pages of meticulous observations. Dates, times, witnesses. The time he'd berated a housekeeping manager for not providing extra towels fast enough. The incident where he'd forced a bellhop to carry bags that exceeded safety guidelines. The countless moments when he'd treated human beings as inconveniences to his comfort. Do you understand what you've done? David asked, his voice carrying the weight of cultural disappointment. In Chinese business philosophy, how you treat those who serve you reflects how you'll treat your partners when the relationship becomes challenging. Richard looked around the room at faces that had shifted from deference to judgment. His own team couldn't meet his eyes. The power dynamic had completely reversed. He was now the one being evaluated, found wanting, dismissed. The $1.5 million was never the real prize, David continued. This partnership was designed to be a gateway to Pacific Rim markets worth hundreds of millions. Our Hong Kong office, our Shanghai connections, our Tokyo partnerships, all of it depended on finding an American partner who understood that business success requires character. Margaret closed her portfolio with finality. Your building empire may be impressive, Mr. Blackstone, but empires built on disrespect for others ultimately crumble from within. Richard felt something crack inside his chest, not his pride, though that was certainly shattered, but something deeper. The recognition that he'd spent decades becoming someone he didn't actually want to be. What would it take? He whispered. The question hung in the air like a lifeline thrown into stormy waters. David and Margaret exchanged glances, a lifetime of family communication passing between them in seconds. That, said Margaret, depends entirely on whether you're asking how to save this deal, or how to save yourself. Richard's question hung in the air, like smoke from a fire that had consumed everything he thought he knew about himself. The boardroom felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in as decades of accumulated arrogance collapsed into a single moment of desperate clarity. Save myself, he said finally, his voice cracking slightly. I want to save myself. Margaret studied him with the same intensity she'd once used to analyze billion-dollar market trends. 25 years of reading people, of understanding the difference between performance and genuine transformation, had taught her to recognize authentic moments of reckoning. Do you understand what that means? She asked quietly. Saving yourself isn't about salvaging this contract or protecting your reputation. It's about acknowledging that the man you've become isn't the man you could be. Richard's hands trembled as he reached for his water glass. Around the table, his legal team shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that this conversation had moved far beyond their expertise, into territory where contracts and negotiations held no power. I built an empire, he whispered. Everything I touched turned to gold. I thought that made me worthy. You built buildings, Margaret corrected gently. Buildings aren't legacies. How you treat people, that's what echoes through generations. David watched his aunt work, recognizing the same patient precision she'd used to guide him through his own leadership challenges. Margaret had a gift for finding the precise pressure point where pride cracked open to reveal the human being underneath. Tell me about your father, Margaret said suddenly. The question seemed to come from nowhere, but Richard's face immediately tightened. My father built the foundation of everything I own. He taught me that respect is earned through strength, that weakness is exploitation waiting to happen. And your mother? Richard's eyes flickered with something raw and unguarded. She was kind to everyone. The mailman, the grocery clerks, the cleaning lady. My father used to say it made her weak, that people would take advantage of her generosity. Margaret leaned forward slightly. Which parent were you thinking about yesterday when you refused to shake my hand? The question hit like a physical blow. Richard saw his father's face, heard his voice echoing through childhood memories. Never show weakness, son. Never let them think you're one of them. My father, he admitted, the words feeling like confessing to murder. And which parent would you want to see you in this moment? Richard closed his eyes, and suddenly he could see his mother's face. The way she'd smile at strangers, the way she'd remembered the names of service workers, the way she'd taught him that kindness was strength, not weakness. "My mother," he whispered. "God help me, my mother." The transformation beginning in that moment would cost Richard Blackstone everything he thought he wanted, and give him everything he never knew he needed. 3 months after the boardroom confrontation, Richard Blackstone stood in the employee break room of the Grand Pacific Hotel at 6:30 a.m., wearing jeans and a flannel shirt instead of his usual $1,000 suits. He was pouring coffee for the housekeeping staff beginning their morning shift. "Good morning, Rosa," he said, handing a steaming cup to the woman who'd befriended Margaret years earlier. "How's your daughter's college application process going?" Rosa accepted the coffee with a mixture of gratitude and continuing bewilderment. 3 months ago, Richard Blackstone wouldn't have known her name. Now he asked about her family, her dreams, her challenges with the same attention he'd once reserved for million-dollar deals. "She got accepted to Seattle University, Mr. Blackstone. The scholarship program you created. It's going to make everything possible." Richard's smile carried none of his former calculated charm. This was something new, genuine joy at another person's success. "She earned that scholarship, Rosa. I just helped remove some barriers." The Blackstone Employee Education Initiative had been his first concrete step toward redemption. Instead of expanding his real estate portfolio, he'd liquidated assets to create a $50 million endowment providing college scholarships for children of service workers throughout Seattle. Margaret appeared in the doorway, observing the morning ritual that had become Richard's new routine. For 90 consecutive days, he'd arrived early to work alongside the staff he'd once ignored, learning their names, their stories, their struggles. "Morning coffee, philosophical discussions again?" she asked with gentle humor. "Rosa was just telling me about Maria's acceptance letter," Richard replied, his pride evident. 4 kids from this hotel alone are starting college this fall." Margaret nodded approvingly. The transformation hadn't been instant or easy. The first month had been painful to watch, Richard stumbling through conversations with people he'd trained himself not to see, his discomfort obvious as he tried to unlearn decades of practiced superiority. But something authentic had emerged from the wreckage of his former self. The man who now remembered the security guard's birthday, who knew the custodian's grandson was fighting cancer, who personally delivered Christmas bonuses to every employee's family. This version of Richard Blackstone was entirely new. "David called this morning," Margaret said. "Chen Industries has been watching your progress." Richard's hands stilled on his coffee cup. The merger that had started this entire transformation remained officially suspended, neither rejected nor approved. Chen Industries had been conducting their own kind of due diligence, observing whether Richard's changes would prove lasting or merely performative. "And," he asked quietly, "he wants to schedule another meeting. Not about the original contract, something bigger." Richard looked around the break room at the faces of people who'd become genuinely important to him and realized that regardless of what Chen Industries decided, he'd already gotten everything he'd never known he wanted. The second Chen Industries meeting took place not in a sterile boardroom, but in the community center Richard had built in Seattle's International District. The former site of a luxury condo development he'd abandoned, it now housed after-school programs, job training workshops, and cultural events that bridged Seattle's diverse communities. David Chen walked through the facility with obvious amazement. Children from a dozen different countries played together in the gymnasium. Elderly immigrants attended English classes in bright, airy classrooms. Adults learned computer skills in a state-of-the-art technology center. "This represents $40 million of infrastructure investment," Richard explained as they toured the facilities. "But the real investment is in futures we're helping to build." They paused outside a classroom where Margaret was teaching a business English course to recent immigrants. Through the window, they could see her patient attention to each student, her natural gift for making complex concepts accessible to people still learning the language. "She refused to let me hire professional instructors," Richard said with obvious affection. "Said that teaching reminds her why business matters. It's supposed to create opportunities for everyone, not just the people already at the top." David studied Richard carefully. The transformation was visible in everything from his posture to his choice of words. Gone was the aggressive confidence that had once defined him, replaced by something quieter, but infinitely stronger. The original partnership proposal was worth $1.5 million, David said finally. But Chen Industries has been developing a different kind of opportunity. Richard turned from the window, curiosity replacing the anxiety that had once driven all his business dealings. We're launching a Pacific Rim initiative focused on ethical business practices and community development. Partnerships with companies that demonstrate genuine commitment to social responsibility. The initial investment would be $50 million, with potential for expansion into markets worth billions. The numbers should have excited Richard, but instead he found himself thinking about Rosa's daughter, about the security guard whose night school tuition he'd paid, about the dozens of families whose lives had been changed by his decision to use wealth as a tool for lifting others up. What would be required, he asked. Complete transparency in business practices, regular community impact assessments, profit-sharing programs with employees, and… David paused, smiling. A commitment to treating every person you encounter with the same respect you'd show a CEO. Richard laughed, a sound that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. I think I can manage that. Margaret appeared in the doorway, having finished her class. The students want to thank you for the scholarship program, she told Richard. Especially Mrs. Nguyen. Her son starts medical school next month. As Richard walked toward the classroom full of grateful faces, David realized that Chen Industries wasn't just gaining a business partner. They were joining forces with a man who'd learned that true success wasn't about how high you could climb, but how many people you could bring with you. 2 years later, the Blackstone Chen Foundation had transformed Seattle's landscape in ways no skyscraper ever could. What began with one refused handshake had rippled into a movement that touched thousands of lives across the Pacific Northwest. Margaret Chen, now 60, stood before the United Nations Business Ethics Council, delivering a keynote address on authentic transformation in corporate leadership. The hotel receptionist had become a globally recognized expert on ethical business practices, her story inspiring companies worldwide to examine how they treated their most vulnerable stakeholders. Richard Blackstone sat in the audience, no longer the CEO of his empire, but something far more valuable. A catalyst for change. His foundation had created jobs for 2,000 formerly overlooked workers, funded education for 500 children, and established ethical business standards that other companies were racing to adopt. The most expensive handshake refusal in history had ultimately cost Richard his old life and given him a new one worth living. Sometimes the best transformations begin with the worst mistakes, and the most powerful people are those who choose to lift others up rather than look down. If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button and like, because everyone deserves to be seen.